Welcome everyone to this very special Greytalk hosted by Dr. Rubens Ricupero from Sao Paulo, Brazil, with the title, Is the War in Ukraine a Threat to the Survival or Relevance of the United Nations? A replay of the League of Nations in the 1930s. We are delighted and honored to have Dr. Ricupero addressing this Greytalk just a few days after he accepted to become our honorary president at large. And of course, why at large? Well, he is 9,400 kilometers away from Geneva. And in Geneva, we already have our honorary president, Michael Muller, who is possibly one of the most respected living former civil servants in Geneva. It would take the whole length of the Greytalk to describe the professional journey of Dr. Rubens Ricupero, so I would refer you all to Wikipedia and Google, but nevertheless, I would like to mention that Dr. Rubens Ricupero was UNCTAD's 5th Secretary General from September 95 to September 2004. His diplomatic posts have included ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva, to the United States of America, and to Italy. At GATT, he served as chairman of the Council of the Representatives, chairman of the GATT contracting parties, chairman of the Committee on Trade and Development, and chairman and spokesperson of the Informal Group on Developing Countries. Dr. Ricupero has been, is, and will always be a highly appreciated and respected professor. This is indeed a very special Greytalk, since it is taking place while the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is raging, and while the Western countries are celebrated yesterday and the Russian Federation celebrated today the same victory. But there is a global feeling that the two sides are celebrating different things, or celebrating the same thing with different perspectives. We all know the saying, perspective is everything when you are experiencing the challenges of life. The focus of Dr. Recupero's Greytalk will be on the role, relevance, and survival of the United Nations. And I'm sure he will walk us from the different perspectives that people and countries have on the role, relevance, and survival of the United Nations. As they say, never miss a good crisis to go to waste. So does the United Nations survival matter? Or should we better hope for a new start like a phoenix bird under the different structure, doing things in a different way? Professor Ricupero, we are eager to hear you and your perspective. Manuela Tortora, our Vice President, will tell us now how the Greytalk will develop, as well as the Q&A session. Manuela, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. The rules of the game are very simple. We will listen very carefully to Mr. Recupero's presentation. And by the way, his text will be posted on our website together with the recording of this session in the next 3-4 days. And for the Q&A session, please write in a short, I repeat, short sentence your question or your comment in the column, and I will try to regroup according to the topics of the question so that we put some order in the discussion after Mr. Recupero's presentation. Thank you again, Mr. Ricupero, for being with us, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I must say I feel very happy to see all the names and the faces of old friends in Geneva. And I have a strange feeling as if a time machine would take me back 25 years ago when I was still living in Geneva and was interacting with all of you. Of course, since a long time, I have been far from those matters. I only follow international affairs as an observer, as a teacher on international affairs. And anyway, I felt as a great opportunity when Manuela invited me to talk to you, because it gave me the occasion to put my ideas a little bit more in order and to try to share with you some of my concerns. Of course, I know that we all belong to the branch of international civil servants who worked for development. It's not exactly the subject of my talk today. You know that in old days, Kofi Annan would complain because people asked from him things that he could not do in terms of peace and security. And he would say, well, the 90% or more of the UN, what the UN does has nothing to do directly with peace and security. It is development aid, it is humanitarian affairs, it is refugees, it's human rights, but people only ask me about peace and security. It was one of his frustrations. But anyway, I will try to do my best dealing with this subject. So let me start by saying that indeed the war in Ukraine poses a very serious threat to the United Nations' very raison d'etre in more than 3/4 of a century of existence. Its unique character stems from several reasons. It is a type of crisis the UN is structurally, and I would like to underline this word, structurally helpless to handle. It comes from a major nuclear power, one of the main founding fathers of the UN, a Security Council permanent member with a veto right. And worst of all, there is a strong possibility that the Russian aggression may signal a willingness to radically challenge the international security architecture of which the UN is an essential component. The ultimate purpose of the United Nations organization was to avoid the repetition of the two world wars and to ensure international peace through a system of collective security. The functioning of that mechanism was predicated on the assumption that the victorious Allied countries in World War II would keep the unity of views regarding the permanent necessity of the order they created. If that failed, the whole system would, of course, be in jeopardy. And an implicit corollary of this sine qua non condition of unity was that in its substance, the UN would be powerless to cope with the conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers mainly responsible for its creation. That unfortunate situation soon materialized as the unity between the two former allies gave rise to a world divided into two antagonistic in ideology, two blocks ideologically antagonistic. And from the start, all the important episodes of the Cold War, the Berlin blockade, the construction of the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, were played out exclusively between the two superpowers, with the UN performing at best a supporting role to record the agreed outcomes. Despite the original project frustration, the US and the Soviet Union gradually produced a framework to manage their competition that succeeded in avoiding a direct clash between them from the late 1940s until the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. Its cornerstone was no longer collective security, but tacit recognition and respect for each bloc areas of influence, a modality of the old-fashioned balance of power. The unwritten law that gave some stability to the arrangement was that no one would attempt to subvert the strategic parity between the blocs and reach a clear strategic superiority that would threaten the survival of the other side. Such a danger came about in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the two superpowers nearly clashed in a direct nuclear confrontation in the most dangerous threat to the Cold War equilibrium of terror ever. Once again, without any significant UN action, Armageddon was avoided at the last minute through bilateral negotiations, this time between John Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. Those direct negotiations opened the way for a period of détente and of a series of agreements on nuclear arms control. Two meaningful aspects deserve attention at this stage. First, the Cold War rendered the collective security mechanism useless for disagreements between the two superpowers, but did not entirely eliminate it. The Cold War framework coexisted in parallel to collective security. Whenever the two superpowers did not collide, it proved possible to use the security collective mechanism even against the interests of other permanent council members. That was the case during the 1956 Suez Canal crisis. The United Kingdom and France did veto a Security Council order to cease the military operation. However, that did not prevent the UN General Assembly, with the support of the USA and of the Soviet Union, from establishing the first United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF, to secure and supervise the cessation of hostilities. That measure was based on the 1950 Korean War precedent of the Uniting for Peace resolution. Other examples were the decolonization process, the first Gulf War against the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, the numerous cases of more or less successful peacekeeping operations. Consequently, the really existing international order consisted of two elements: the hybrid articulation of two parallel systems, the Cold War balance of terror and the UN collective security mechanism. The former was a competitive arrangement, the latter a cooperative one. It was a far cry from the original dream of the San Francisco Charter, but somehow it helped avoid a third world war. The second aspect that is particularly relevant to our case, and here I come to the object of our talk, is that none of the superpowers was interested in wrecking the redistribution of power, territory, and the spheres of influence that resulted from their victory in the Second World War. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as the most feared and powerful country in Europe. It expanded its territory to the detriment of Finland, Poland, Germany, Romania, and others. It annexed the Baltic countries. It consolidated its domination over the states in East Europe and most of Central Europe. Although the fear of the Red Army prompted the creation of NATO, the truth is that neither Stalin nor his successors risked using military power for the sake of gaining further expansion gains. The Soviet Union did intervene against the challenges to its domination in areas that since Yalta had already been included within its sphere of influence: East Berlin and East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland. But it refrained from interfering outside of its sphere. In the Greek Civil War, in Tito's Yugoslavia, in subverting occupied Austria, in divided Berlin. All in all, the Soviet Union may have been revolutionary in its ideological crusade against capitalism. It certainly encouraged internal subversion by communist parties everywhere. But as regards international order, it behaved very much as a status quo power. That, and I underline what I'm going to say, that may constitute the crucial difference between the attitude of the Soviet Union then and that of the Russian Federation now. The USSR was a winner, a satisfied great power, confident that it would continue to increase its power until the final inevitable victory over capitalism predicted by Marxist interpretation of history. Russia, on the contrary, is undoubtedly a loser that sees itself, in Putin's words, as the victim, and I quote, the worst geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, end of quotation. A declining power, once described by President Obama as, and I quote again, just a regional, not a global power, end of quotation, unsure of itself, with a problematic future in terms of dwindling demography and a vulnerable commodity-dependent economy, Russia is certainly dissatisfied with the secondary place to which it has been relegated at the international order by the dissolution of the USSR. The only admissible doubt about Russia's dissatisfaction with the current international system regards the degree and depth of that feeling. Is it possible to placate Russian resentment with specific limited concessions, such as the neutralization of Ukraine? Or are Moscow foreign policy objectives such that they would require nothing less than the rollback of the security architecture established in Eastern Europe over the last 30 years, that is, NATO's expansion to the former members of the Warsaw Pact and the Baltic countries, the freedom of nations like Ukraine to eventually join the European Union? Russia is definitely a revisionist power as regards the international security and the territorial fallout of the dissolution of the USSR. There is nothing criminal or sinister in seeking a revision, a correction, or an updating of international rules, although the Americans may sound this way. The way the Americans use the expression revisionist power is as if it were a sort of a sinister plot to destroy the world. But in reality, improving the status quo has been the essence of developing countries' actions on multilateral fora. UNCTAD was born as an attempt to revise and updating the world trading system. The Kofi Annan UN summit in December 2005 was the most ambitious effort until that date to revise and update the UN system. So the big question is not Russian revisionism per se, but whether it can still assume a reformist and a negotiated form acceptable to other concerned parties, or has it already become an irrevocably revolutionary outlook that can only be satisfied with the destruction of the international system? To grasp what is at stake in this alternative, it is necessary to show the differences in consequences of one approach or the other. In his A World Restored, Metternich, Kesselring, and the Problems of Peace, 1812-1822, Henry Kissinger describes what he calls a revolutionary foreign policy in the following terms. Here I would like to very strongly advise to you to try to reread Kissinger, just the 3 first pages of his introduction. They are remarkable, they are brilliant, and they help us understand the world of today. But he described the revolutionary foreign policy in the following terms, and I quote, "Whenever there exists a power which considers the international order oppressive, relations between it and other powers will be revolutionary. In such cases, it's not the adjustment of differences within a given system which will be at issue, but the system itself." End of quotation. He continues with words that strangely fit the current Russian position. It is amazing to think that the book was written back in 1954 as Kissinger's doctoral dissertation at Harvard University. And I quote again, "The motivation of the revolutionary power may well be defensive. It may well be sincere in its protestations of feeling threat, as Putin did today in his speech. But the distinguishing feature of a revolutionary power is not that it feels threatened, but nothing can reassure it. Only absolute security, the neutralization of the opponent, is considered a sufficient guarantee, and thus the desire of one power for absolute security means absolute insecurity for all the others. The essence of a revolutionary power is that it is willing, indeed eager, to push its principles to their ultimate conclusion. Because in revolutionary situations, the contending systems are less concerned with the adjustment of a difference than with the subversion of loyalties. It is the case exactly of Ukraine, the subversion of an old loyalty towards a new one. So in those situations, diplomacy is replaced either by war or by an armaments race. End of quotation. Those are texts I took from Kissinger, and there are many others that I would like to recommend to you. Keeping in mind Kissinger's remarks, it's hard to deny that there are in Putin's actions some strong elements of a revolutionary foreign policy. This is evident not so much in the declared desire to reverse NATO's expansion and even the national existence or autonomy of countries like Ukraine. The trouble proceeds from Putin's willingness, if not eagerness, to resort to military force to reach the reforms he seeks in the European security architecture. It is not a matter of one or two isolated incidents, but of a repeated pattern of a growing escalation in scale and destruction that started with the military intervention against Georgia in 2008, passed through the annexation of Crimea and the fostering of secessionist movements in the two Donbass provinces in 2014, culminating now in the invasion of Ukraine in the largest military operation of the kind since the end of the Second World War. The two classical examples of a revolutionary foreign policy given by Kissinger are French policy during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic eras, and closer to us, Germany's foreign policy after the Treaty of Versailles. The German offensive to destroy the security architecture from Versailles also followed a sequence of escalating steps: rearmament against the treaty's provisions, withdrawal from the League of Nations, military reoccupation of the Rhineland, Austria's Anschluss, the annexation of the Sudetenland after the Pact of Munich, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, war against Poland, and the start of the Second World War. Of course, I'm not comparing Nazi Germany with Putin's Russia, two completely different countries in ideology and orientation. I am only calling attention to the undeniable similarity in the methods employed by both nations, sometimes even in details of what the Russians call maskirovka, measures of camouflage, denial, and deception, as in the annexation of Crimea and in the weeks before the invasion of Ukraine. In the 1930s, it was only after a succession of repeated violations that it finally became obvious that no number of specific concessions would placate Berlin, whose objectives could only be attained through the destruction of the international system in place. It's far from clear, in my personal opinion, that we are now facing a similar situation. On the controversial question of deciding whether the Russian version of revisionism belongs to the milder category of a reformist foreign policy or to the more intractable revolutionary approach, international analysts split along lines that closely mirror another controversy. I refer to the vexata question of the responsibility of the USA for NATO's enlargement as the main factor for the emergence in Moscow of a leader like Putin and for the aggressive reorientation of Russian attitudes towards the West. Not long ago, on April the 19th, less than a month ago, 2022, Foreign Affairs conducted a survey asking 61 leading experts on international relations to debate the following statement, and I quote, "Proceeding with a NATO enlargement after the end of the Cold War was a strategic mistake," end of quotation. With different levels of confidence, the panel is split as follows. 19 strongly disagreed. 19 strongly disagreed that NATO's expansions had been a strategic mistake. 18 disagreed. 3 were neutral. 7 agreed. And 11 strongly agreed. Among them, Professor John Mearsheimer, as one could assume. Such a broad dispersion of opinions among the best experts in the field is a sure indication that we are not going to be able to solve this question. This controversy has a bright future ahead, now and perhaps until the last final judgment, because opinions are really very much divided. It is noteworthy that Eastern European experts and politicians from countries that were forced members of the Soviet bloc or that were annexed by the Soviet Union strongly disagree with the statement. To dismiss that position as stemming from anti-Russian prejudice may appear as insensitive to the legitimate concerns of those who are geographically closer to Russia and historically were the victims of Russian imperialism only a few decades ago. Regardless of what one could think on this respect, the Russian aggression has created a wholly new situation on the ground, apparently vindicating those who favored from the start NATO's enlargement as a means to provide security to the more exposed countries. An indication in this sense is the possible decision by neutral countries like Finland and Sweden to join NATO. Experts who believe that NATO expansion was a strategic mistake tend also to think that Russian revisionism belongs to the milder reformist tendency. They equally trust that adequate concessions could eventually lead to a satisfactory settlement of Russians' grievances. In contrast, supporters of NATO enlargement fear that Putin pursues a revolutionary project of recovering as much as possible of the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. That would necessarily entail the utter destruction of the system that has guaranteed the independence and security of countries situated in that area of influence. So far, the realities of the war in Ukraine do not validate, in my opinion, do not validate in full any of the two explanations. An indication that the situation is still fluid and can evolve in one direction or its opposite. Russian war aims are somewhat muddled. They seem to vary according to the chances of a battle, and so are Putin's presumably minimal conditions for a reasonable negotiated settlement. On the other hand, even if Putin harbors revolutionary maximalist aspirations, he does not have the means to achieve them. Irrespective of subjective intentions attributed to Moscow, the Russians do not possess, except in terms of self-destructive nuclear weaponry, the terrible efficacy of the German war machine, fortunately for us. It's not so much a matter of aspirations, but of capabilities. Much then will depend on the fortunes of war. Here we should call to mind Clausewitz's warning, and I quote, "War is the realm of uncertainty. 3/4 of the factors on which action in war is based are wrapped in a fog of greater or lesser uncertainty." End of quotation. Among the various shapes the war can take in terms of length, atrocity, destruction, and ending, the worst would be a sort of sleepwalker escalation leading to a third world war, an unwanted overreaction that all sides have been careful to avoid until now. There should be an equal effort to prevent the current situation from freezing into an irreversible new incarnation of the Cold War. That worrying trend predated the war and was accelerated by it. Its hardening would deepen the division of the world into two hostile blocs, representative democracies against authoritarian regimes, the USA and the West against Russia and China. It would set back the free flow of ideas, communications, trade, and human contacts. International relations would become militarized. Spending in weapons and armies would spiral upwards in detriment of the fight against the real dangers threatening the planet: global warming, famine, pandemics, migrations, human rights, gender equality, elimination of poverty, and underdevelopment. It is because they do not want to be dragged into this kind of inversion of human priorities that some representative developing countries have been adopting at the UN a thoughtful attitude of condemning aggression without accepting automatic alignments with the blocs. It's time now to go back to the subject of our talk and reach some conclusions. The war in Ukraine is undeniably a challenge to the UN, but not in the way it is commonly assumed. The UN could have never prevented nor stopped the war because it never had the power to do so. It never had the power to do so. The responsibility for this impotence belongs squarely with the Big Five that insisted in protecting their national sovereignty and interests with the right of veto, the incurable original sin of the Charter. Harry Truman wrote in his memoirs, and I quote, "Without such a veto, no arrangement would have passed the Senate." End of quotation. This was the situation then, and this even worsened continues to be the situation right now. As Immanuel Kant wrote, and I quote again, "Out of a timber so crooked as that from which man is made, nothing entirely straight can be built." End of quotation. This is what applies to the UN. Out of a timber so crooked, nothing entirely straight can be built. People's frustration with UN shortcomings, at least in cases like the current one, derives from what the UN should have been, the ideal UN, not with what it actually is, the real UN, what it has become as a result of the deliberate design of the great powers. On insisting in unanimous agreement among them, the Big Five incapacitated the UN, made it unfit for the lofty task of ensuring peace, security, and the rule of law in the world. Nevertheless, what the power of the great could neither give to the organization nor take away from it is legitimacy, moral authority. Legitimacy can only emanate from the free and continuous consent and support of the majority of the international community. In other terms, from the people, as in any democracy. This is the main difference between the UN and its unlucky predecessor, the League of Nations, which suffered since its foundation from an acute deficit of universality and representativity due to the absence of the United States, the Soviet Union, Germany at the beginning, and most of the world that were still dominated by colonial powers. In those days, countries would withdraw from the League without second thoughts, as Japan and Germany did in 1933, Italy in 1937. The Soviet Union, as you know, was the only power to be expelled in 1939 because of the invasion of Finland. At the time of the outbreak of World War II, more than 15 countries had already voluntarily left. In contrast, no country has ever dreamed of leaving the UN, whose membership covers the whole planet. In almost 77 years, 3 successive human generations were spared the scourge of a new world war, and not a single time a nuclear device was used again after Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The UN system was flexible enough to accommodate major changes that in older days would probably set off a generalized war. And I quote, communist China's rise and its acceptance as a permanent member of the Security Council, the end of Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the decolonization process, the end of apartheid in South Africa. The UN may not have been the only or the main factor behind each of these changes, but it is certainly provided the multilateral framework for their peaceful development. In the policy space that was left to the UN, the achievements of the organization regarding Ukraine may not have been decisive, they could not be, but should not be dismissed as irrelevant. The Hague International Court of Justice decision by 13 votes against 2, ordering Russia to immediately suspend its attacks and cease all military operations. 2 General Assembly resolutions deploring the invasion, adopted by very expressive majorities. two Security Council resolutions, one vetoed by Russia, the most recent carried by unanimity, expressing deep concern regarding the maintenance of peace and security in Ukraine and recalling the obligation to settle international disputes by peaceful means. It is ironic that that resolution did not raise the opposition of Russia. They agreed. The Council also expressed strong support for the Secretary General's efforts in the search for a peaceful solution to the conflict and in ensuring the evacuation of hundreds of trapped civilians from Mariupol. What these achievements have in common and bring to light is that the UN is a unique source of international legitimacy and of a moral authority in world affairs. It is something that only the UN can provide, and no country, however powerful, can do without. When in 2003, the United States illegally invaded Iraq in a flagrant violation of the UN Charter mentioned by Putin as a precedent, it did not take long, only a few months, for Washington to go back to the Security Council in search of the legitimacy and the legal authority to clean up the mess. In conclusion, despite the war, the UN will continue to be the indispensable organization in the world, because nothing can replace its unique role as the source of a moral and legal legitimacy in international matters. It stands as the major obstacle against the forces, the obscure forces that want to take the world back to the lawless era of a naked power competition that almost led to the destruction of a human civilization in two barbaric world wars. This is why Dag Hammarskjöld, perhaps the greatest of UN Secretary Generals, was right when he reminded us, and I quote, that the United Nations was not created to get us to heaven, but to save us from hell. End of quotation. Thank you very much for your patience for this very long talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Dr. Ricupero. Well, I think that everybody...
I talked for too long.
No,
sorry,
don't worry. Don't worry. As we said, we are not on radio, so the time is under our control anyway. And I would like to open the floor to written questions as short as possible, so that we can manage the reading of the question and the time that is left. So the floor is open to everybody. In the meanwhile, while everybody still is digesting your very insightful and very, very deep reflections, I would like to ask you what is your view about the future? I mean, what can be the short-term future for the UN, assuming that this war will end or will be prolonged, but what can the UN do in realistic terms in the next few months or years to keep at least a role from the point of view of the legitimacy that you just mentioned, Mr. Ricupero?
Well, let me say, Manuela, that despite what Russia has been doing, Russia itself has no wish to wreck the UN or to withdraw from it. If you read the joint communique between the Russians and the Chinese of February the 4th, this famous document that spoke about a friendship without limits, it's a very long communique. I think practically very few people have gone through the trouble of reading it. But it has very long paragraphs endorsing the UN. I would say even in a much more emphatic terms than you usually see from the Western countries. It is a very, let I say, very persuasive, a very strong endorsement of the UN. You see, in the 1930s, when the organization voted a resolution against Japan, Japan immediately withdrew from the League of Nations. Now Russia is not withdrawing from the UN or from the International Court of Justice because, it may sound as hypocrisy, but hypocrisy is, as a famous writer once said, the homage that vice renders to virtue. That is, you may violate the law, but you recognize that the source of legitimacy is the UN. So there is no replacement for this source. In the Middle Ages, it was the Pope who was the source of legitimacy. It is true, the Pope has completely lost that authority because of the way the popes used the authority. But in the Middle Ages, the source of legitimacy was religious. Nowadays, it stems from the people. It's the same theory that legitimates democracy. It is the free consent and support of countries in the world that makes the UN irreplaceable. There is nothing that the US or the United Kingdom or the Europeans could do to replace that situation. Having said so, I recognize that this is not enough. It is not enough to stop naked power from destroying a nation, because in reality, we have to be realistic. The only way of stopping power is through a superior power, a superior military power. And the only possible country that would have that power would be the United States. And it is refraining from using that power for a justifiable reason. The US doesn't want to see an escalation of the Ukraine war. As President Biden has said many times, the US doesn't want to be the cause for the Third World War, as nobody wants to be the cause for that. So how can you stop a nuclear power intent in destroying a smaller neighbor? It is the old fable of the cat. Who is going to put the what's the name in English? The bell in the neck of the cat. Who is going to really stop the Russians from doing what they are doing? There is only one possibility, that the fortunes of war will show that they will not prevail. And sooner or later, they will have to be forced to come to terms with the reality. It's not a satisfactory answer, I know, because in the meanwhile, people will continue to be massacred, towns will be continue to be destroyed, but it is the only way you can hope that there will be a way out of this crisis. I know it is frustrating for all of us, but so far we have seen that the war is not going so well for the Russians. So perhaps this is an indication that sooner or later they will have to compromise.
Yes, thank you. I have two comments or questions by David, and then one question from Craig Van Krestek, that you know very well.
Very well, David, a good friend of ours.
Yes, indeed. David is asking what would happen, in your view, if, from the point of view of the legitimacy, the prestige, the moral prestige of the UN, if Russia would continue to consolidate and even continue attacking not only Ukraine, but maybe other countries. And a second part of his question, what do you think about the creation of a special tribunal for the war crimes of Putin, concretely, as a demonstration that the UN can react, can do something about the war crimes?
Well, the first question, I don't think that even an eventual Russian victory and the continuation of the aggression would in any way dent or diminish the legitimacy, the moral legitimacy of the UN. It would, of course, be a threat to the stability of the international order, because the UN, we should not confuse the UN with the international order. The international order, as I made it clear in my presentation, is broader than the UN, because the balance of power is part of the international order. The balance of power is not a legal part of the international order, but it is a de facto part of the international order. So the international order is based on some restraint on the part of powers in terms of the way they defend their national interests. If that restraint is lacking, we will have wars. In each case, there is no restraint, we are going to have wars. And I think that in that eventuality, if Russia, just to think about a hypothetical situation that I don't think that will happen, but in case Russia wins in Ukraine and tries, for instance, to do the same regarding Estonia, for instance, where you also have a significant minority of Russian-speaking people. In this case, we would have a war with NATO and probably the Third World War. I can't say whether this war would inevitably conduct to the use of weapons of mass destruction, but it's likely that it could lead to that. So I don't think it is a matter of affecting the legitimacy. It is a matter of affecting the efficacy of the international order. And this is why, by the way, countries are arming Ukraine with modern weapons in order to try to make impossible for Putin to succeed. Regarding the International Tribunal, I don't think it would be feasible because at least according to the charter, such a tribunal would have to be approved by the Security Council. And of course, the Russians would veto. We already have the International Criminal Court in Rome, the Treaty of Rome in The Hague. Huh? But you see, in this respect is where we can see the double standards of the Western world. The Americans are talking about making Russia accountable for the violations, but the Americans have been the ones that have tried entirely to undermine the international court, the International Criminal Court. You know that the Americans have not only unsigned the treaty, but they have put pressure on countries to leave the International Criminal Court because the Americans, as the West, they are hypocritical in this matter. They condemn the Russians, but they themselves, they were guilty of crimes, or they tried to protect some protected countries like Israel of being judged in the International Criminal Court. So this is why I think this idea of judging the crimes will not succeed, because it is again in some sort of way a replication of the problem of the veto. The reason why we don't have a functioning International Criminal Court is because of the opposition of the big powers, not of the international community in general.
Yes, thank you. I have some other questions. One by Craig, as I mentioned before, unsurprisingly, he's concerned about the WTO, and he says, when Serbia transgressed the rule against genocide, it was expelled from the GATT. WTO rules do provide for the expulsion of members, but would the expulsion of Russia from the WTO merely accelerate the degeneration of that institution via the reintroduction of power politics?
Yes, indeed, I believe so. I'm not in favor of expelling countries, because however indignant we can feel regarding the current situation, we have to reflect that sooner or later the world will have to coexist with Russia and other countries. When I look at this war, what I personally regret the more is the fact that it is inverting priorities. If you take the case, for instance, of the economic logic of supplying gas and oil to Western Europe, it is enough to glance at the map to see that the logical thing to do is to buy gas and oil from the Russians, not from the Emirates. So if the consequence, the unfortunate consequence of this war is to cut trade with Russia, we would be back to the situation we were in the height of the Cold War. You remember at that time there was no significant trade between the West and the communist countries. So my impression is that what we should strive for is for some kind of settlement, a ceasefire and a peace agreement that would allow for a detente. This is why I mentioned the precedent of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In reality, the crisis in Crimea, in Ukraine, may be terrible at the current moment, but it was not the most dangerous crisis in the post-war world. As you know, the missile crisis of Cuba threatened a direct nuclear confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. It was much more dangerous than the current one, but it was finally solved through bilateral negotiations, and out of that, we had a longer period of détente and also a succession of nuclear arms controls. So why not dream that the war in Ukraine could also lead to a situation of détente? Because I think that one of the worst outcomes of this current crisis is not only the possibility of escalation of a third world war, but a much more realistic outcome, but equally deplorable, would be the freezing of this situation into a permanent Cold War, as we had before. You know, the reason why so many developing countries are hesitant to support the sanctions is because no one wants to go back to the Cold War time, because that would be a situation where you would be pressured to choose sides all the time. And in this situation, how could we fight global warming, for instance? It would be impossible. If you have on the one side of the world, the West and the US, on the other side, Russia and China, we would be entirely incapable of doing something regarding the most grave problems that we face. So I would say we have to find a negotiated settlement. There is no other alternative. Now it seems impossible, but there were crises where danger was even bigger, and finally we were able to find a negotiated framework. So just to be explicit, I don't favor expulsions. I think it was a mistake to expel Russia from the Council of Human Rights. In that situation, it was in some sort of way more defensible, because, you know, the Council has a rule that only countries that have a high standard of human rights should be members of the Council. So that would really provide grounds for the expulsion. But even so, I would have a second thought on the expulsion, because expelling countries will only guarantee isolation, and isolation can lead to desperation and to extreme situations.
Thank you so much. I have a question from Khalil Hamdani regarding the 40 countries that abstained in the General Assembly resolutions. And he's asking, should they play a bigger role? What should be the role in the future for these 40 countries?
Well, if they had some common position, they could really play a mediating role. I really wonder if those 40 countries could really come together and try to negotiate between Russia and Ukraine. The other day, the resolution that was approved by unanimity, you know, it was born from an initiative of Norway and Mexico. And what they did, I think, was very worthy, in my opinion, because they tried to put to the Council a resolution that would not alienate Russia or China, as a sort of a first preliminary step to try to go ahead and to negotiate a settlement. So if those 40 countries could have a common position as Mexico and Norway did, I think they could play a useful role, but I don't know exactly what is the chemistry among those countries.
Yeah, thank you. Gabrielle is asking about the role of the UN Secretary General. Should the Secretary General be more aggressive, if I may use the word, in pushing for a peace, a ceasefire, or some other action, be more visible in general?
Well, at the beginning of the crisis, I think it struck everybody that the Secretary General was somewhat, he had adopted a sort of a low-key approach. You will remember that one month ago, the Secretary General of NATO would appear much more often on TV than Antonio Guterres. To some extent, it was natural because the NATO is a military organization. It had much more to do with what was happening. But since then, I think the Secretary General took a different attitude. I applaud his travel to Moscow and Kiev. It was not an easy trip for him. He was not welcome in any of those two countries. I imagine that his conversation with Putin must have been very uncomfortable. You remember the body language of the conversation, each of them at the end of a long table. It was a difficult conversation, practically a dialogue of death. But he did it, and he was very courageous in condemning Russian aggression. And I also believe that he played a useful role, a humanitarian role, in the case of the trapped civilians. Some people will say, well, why only humanitarian fields? Because this is what was left to the UN Secretary General, you know. He doesn't have the power to do otherwise. The only thing he can, where his influence can be felt, is on humanitarian matters. In other matters, he's really very constrained by the big powers, not by any mysterious cause.
I still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions, but I will stop here. The list of questions, I think it's already too much. Harris was asking regarding the financing of the UN. That is not very balanced, not very equal, because the economic powers provide the basic financing, and therefore, what do you think regarding giving these economic powers the control in a way of the UN? How can that be addressed, if it can?
Well, you know, this is a chronic problem. It was already present when I was there many years ago, and I think it will go on. I don't think there is a miraculous solution for that, unless we could find some way as the world, the intellectual property organization invented this register of intellectual property, something that would give the UN an independent source. You know, sometimes people had this idea of a financial tax, the famous tax, to try to finance the UN. But I think we are far from that. In the same way, I have no illusion that now we would have a propitious climate to a meaningful reform of the UN. I don't think we have this situation now. For instance, perhaps in the future, this possibility will arise, but not now.
Rolf is asking if it is realistic to think about the peace agreement of this war in Ukraine, whereby some territorial concessions would be made by Ukraine. Would you think is that feasible?
Well, personally, I would say that this will be a likely outcome of this war. No? Of course, this is not a pleasant idea for Ukrainians after the losses they have endured, and I think they will resist as much as possible. But to be frank, in some cases, like the Crimea and the Donbass, in effective terms, they have already lost their control of those territories 8-9 years ago. No? So that is the situation. And as you know, it's not the only such situation in the world. If you look at the occupied Palestinian territories, you also have a situation, a similar situation. So I think that in realistic terms, this will probably happen, except if the Russians have a complete collapse, which I don't think is likely.
Yeah. Yes. Raymond Senner is asking regarding a comparison, insofar as possible, with the Cuban crisis of missiles, where concessions were made by both sides, the USSR and the US. In this context, in this parallel, do you think that the US and NATO could or should accept to stop the war together with Ukraine, of course?
You know, this is very tempting, but one should pause a little bit to compare the two crises. You know, although the Cuban missile crisis was a more dangerous one than the Ukraine crisis, it was a Cold War crisis, and the reason why we use the word cold is because it was not hot. There were not loss of life and the use of military weapons. So in that respect, the Ukrainian crisis is worse because it started with the invasion. It started with deaths, with destruction. And once you have death and destruction, it becomes much more difficult to have a negotiated settlement that will leave no scars, no bitter resentment. You remember how the missile crisis ended. The US made a commitment that it would not invade Cuba. That was the most important concession, because the reason for the Soviets putting missiles in Cuba was to protect Cuba from an American invasion. Once the Americans made the commitment that they honored until now, 60 years after, once they made the commitment, they would not invade the island. There were no reason to have atomic weapons there. So the Russians, the Soviets, could withdraw the missiles, and there was a further concession. Kennedy, as we know, made a secret promise that he would also withdraw some missiles from Turkey. Those missiles at the time were already old-fashioned. They were not indispensable, but the fact is that it gave the transaction an appearance of an equal transaction, because the Russians would withdraw their missiles and the Americans, they would withdraw the old-fashioned missiles from Turkey. In the case of Ukraine, it's much more difficult to find a situation like this one. You can't have exchange of territories. What you could have in the Ukrainian case would be, and I don't know if the Russians would accept such an outcome, would be an agreement that in the Ukraine, in Crimea and in the Donbass province, there would be a plebiscite supervised by the United Nations, and after a period of some months where neither the Ukraine nor Russia would have a sovereignty in those territories. This would be the only possible guarantee for a fair consultation regarding what the population choice would be. But I doubt the Russians would accept that. Not so much in the Crimea, but in the two Donbass provinces.
Moritz is asking, how do you assess the impact of the military difficulties that are encountered by Russia now in the Ukraine, from the point of view of your analysis of Russia being a moderate revisionist or a revolutionary power?
Well, that is what I tried to say. You know, I'm not sure that I think the Russians could be seen as a revolutionary power, but without the means to do it. You know, the Germans had the means, you know, almost until the very end. The failure of Russia of succeeding in the Ukraine may lead to a milder position, you know, even if it was not their original intention at the beginning. My wife is making signs to me that I should interrupt, because, you know, I sometimes, because of my health, maybe you could send me the questions that were left unanswered. I promise I will send my replies to the people who made the answer. And I apologize to them, but, you know, I have a problem of high blood pressure. I'm already 85 years old, and after some time, I really can't keep on. Thank you.
No, in fact, I will give the floor to Alejandro to close this session and invite everybody to visit our website. I will put the address here where you will find the recording and the document. Thank you so much, Dr. Ricupero.
Please accept my apologies for being too talkative. You will remember that in UNCTAD, it was already my original sin. So I haven't improved very much.
No, Dr. Ricupero, it was really a pleasure to having you with us. It was a really very depth and insightful presentation that you made to all of us. We could have stayed hours here. And I will mention that in the chat, we had requests to have your presentation in writing, which already we have. And you told us that you were going to possibly change a little bit some of the elements. But in any case, it's going to be presented in our webpage and then in our site. Yeah, I think that it will also be useful to translate it. I think with our capacity at Greycells, we could translate it at least into French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And German, we have also German speaker members so that we can have more diffusion on this. This was really a journey, really exciting that you made us. You made us remember that to understand the present, we have to understand the past. The past. But I have this impression that Einstein, he was right when he said that when you approach to a black hole, time and space do not flow at the same speed. And for me, these black holes are this crisis. This world is a black hole, and time and space is not flowing at the same pace as it flew in the previous crisis. Now we don't only have a military war, I think we have a communication war. I'm surprised of the amount of information we get from so many sources every day, and it's so difficult to digest, understand, and compare to what happened in the past. Every single Western country has correspondence in Ukraine now, and we're receiving that information. And that information, it's only flowing in the West, not in Russia. So I think this opens possibly for another great talk. I noticed that I think Alessandra Bellucci, the Director of Communication of United Nations, participated at the great talk. Possibly the role of the civil society, the role of popular support, and the role of media in the decision-making and the developments is also crucial. So thank you very much. We were extremely happy to having you, and we are extremely honored to have you as a great member. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Goodbye.
I hope to see you in Geneva when I go
Yes,
in
please.
July.
We will certainly.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
This is all the hands.